this computer. Thank you for joining us for this fourth session of the Science of Reading with Dr. Adria Truckenmiller. Tonight, she'll be focusing on vocabulary and syntax, and we look forward to you joining us again February 15th. Our final session will be transcription, spelling, handwriting, and keyboarding. And with that, we'll turn it over to Dr. Truckenmiller.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, and thank you for hosting all of this with the Reading League and posting all of the materials and really making things accessible for everyone in Michigan. It's really exciting to be part of this and to be invited to talk to all of you. So diving into my favorite part of the complexity of writing this month, we talked about back in October, the really high level, higher order pieces of writing. We talked about these domain general, meaning not specific to writing, executive functions and cognitions that we need to support all of our writing skills and to help organize all of our writing skills to create this bigger full picture of what we're trying to compose in our writing. And then we dove into the middle of the model in December, and we talked about the really tricky, sticky mediating factors of higher order cognition, which included the inferencing, the reasoning, the perspective taking, or theory of mind, where you're able to envision what somebody else is thinking and trying to get them to where you're thinking in your writing, and then also monitoring your writing, that it's conveying the meaning you want it to. So those things are mediators. What are they mediating? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the words that we come up with and how we put those words together into sentences that's being mediated by those higher order cognitions into this larger discourse that we're trying to express in our written compositions. So let's dive deep into those pieces. Next month, we'll get the final piece of the model, which incorporates all of the things Rebecca was just talking about, which also is tied for my first favorite thing. So, and it used to be my definite most favorite thing. So that'll be a fun month as well to talk. So let's have common definitions in our heads. Vocabulary, very easy. We all are very familiar with vocabulary. It's the knowledge of word meaning. Syntax, syntax or grammar. This is the knowledge of the rule system that governs how words are combined into larger meaningful units, phrases, clauses, or whole sentences. This deals with both the ordering of words and what constraints our language has for how we combine those words into sentences. And syntax is also very helpful for vocabulary. It's reciprocal with vocabulary because it helps the context of the sentence helps us to disambiguate maybe a word that has multiple meanings depending on its context. And now I snuck in a new term in here for you. I said I was going to talk about vocabulary and syntax, but we can't talk about vocabulary and syntax without talking about morphology. And I love morphology. It's getting a lot more attention now in education, which is really exciting. It's always gotten lots of attention within linguistics. But we found some really useful instructional purposes for morphology. So this also nicely will tie into spelling and transcription that we'll talk about next month because morphology envelops vocabulary, it envelops syntax because we have to add affixes onto our words to make them fit different sentences. And it also encompasses spelling because we change the spelling of a word when we add pieces to the word. So morphology, if we were to morphologically break down the word morphology, it will tell you what it means. So the parts of the word morphology, the first part, morph. Morph is meaning. It means a morpheme would be the smallest unit of meaning within a word. And then ology means the study of, right? And so ology is a morpheme. Morph is also a morpheme. And so our ability to recognize that words are made up of smaller parts that have meaning, and if we break down a word into its smaller parts, we can figure out what that bigger word means. This is a fun game I like to play in medical journals. So I can't read a medical journal because I don't know what the words mean, and I don't know what the syntax means because it's discipline-specific language that I haven't had much content knowledge in. But the game I can play is I can pick up a really big word in there and I can start breaking it down. And you know what? I can get about 75% of that word by breaking it down into its morphemes to figure out what it is. So that's an exciting skill to have. Also, here's where I just want to give a quick shout out to Jason Wade on Twitter. Does anybody follow him on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter? Oh, I highly recommend it. He is one of the big nerds with almost as much, oh good, one person's heard, has followed him. He's as much of a nerd, if not more, than I am with how words work. And he's just has this amazing talent and skill of creating it in a way that's so useful for teachers and it looks really pretty. So he puts these out every Monday. He puts out these base words of morphemes, and then he creates these trees where you can see every single prefix and every single suffix that can go with that root word. And then you can play with it and have your students create their own words from this and figure out what it means based on their morphological breakdown. And he gives a couple of examples. So this is yesterday's word. Yesterday he posted ped, which means foot. And then you can create all of these words. Look at these words that come from ped that I had no idea came from ped, including impede. So if we're interfering or slowing something, that kind of makes sense that pede is foot, right? That we're slowing somebody down from moving forward. I thought that was kind of interesting. And he's got a lot of other really cool resources around spelling, syntax, and morphology that I think is just really easy to comprehend. So what we're going to talk about today is I want to show some new and ongoing research about how important the importance of vocabulary and syntax. We're going to talk about which facets of vocabulary and syntax that are important. We'll talk, and then we'll of course go into the most exciting part, some effective instruction that increases vocabulary and syntax. And instead of having our own just one section about how this relates to reading, I'm going to talk about it throughout because it's almost impossible to extricate the role that vocabulary and syntax plays in both reading comprehension and in writing. So I was hoping Taylor Beard was going to be here today. She helped collect this data a long time ago now. This is actually the oldest data that I will talk about tonight. That's from a whole 6 years ago, 2015. This was part of IES's Reading for Understanding initiative, where Barbara Foreman and Rick Wagner led the charge of measuring all of the components of reading comprehension and looking at them together and how they worked together. And the biggest thing that we found from that study was, of course, finding more evidence, again, for the simple view of reading, that it's made up of the decoding components and then the language comprehension components. And we further found that the language side of it fell within these broad categories of vocabulary, well, a little bit narrow categories than we had before, which was just language comprehension. It was broken down to vocabulary, syntax, and listening comprehension, with listening comprehension kind of falling out, not being as important after grade 2 in these models. And so what was interesting with this study also is we came to understand that the type of vocabulary and the type of syntax that was important for grade level reading comprehension was more in the academic register. So we know oral language, the oral register, that is the way we would converse with our friends and family. So the types of words that we would use with our friends and family, like we would probably not often use the word morphology with our friends and family. And we probably wouldn't use really long, complex sentences with our friends and family in conversation. But those things pieces of language are important for school, but what's additionally important to draw our attention to is the academic register. So those words that you would almost only hear in a specific discipline, whether that's a science discipline, social studies, math, or any other career field that we might go into. So this academic facet, this register, was important to look at. And so a lot of us started looking at this academic register more closely, because most of our vocabulary and syntax measures had especially been in the lower grade levels. And for children who have developmental language disorders, which it's also important to understand those, but for the general population of students, we realized it was important to understand what they need to know as well. So going back to the history of where we can find a lot of information on vocabulary and syntax really comes a lot from our wonderful speech language pathologist colleagues. And they, in their study of developmental language disorders, they demonstrated how incredibly important syntax and vocabulary are, because deficits in those areas underlie, of course, developmental language disorders, but also many students with dyslexia tend to struggle with these. There's high comorbidity with math learning disabilities, and of course, writing disabilities, which Berninger calls oral and written language disorder. So in a lot of my writing, I will refer to writing disabilities as oral and written language disorder. I believe the Reading League a while ago had an amazing session. It was pre-COVID with Tiffany Hogan. So if you go on that YouTube channel, hopefully there's a good, or in the resources at the Reading League, I hope people will go look up her session, because she's just dynamic and brilliant, and is the person to listen to, I think, on this. She also has a phenomenal podcast that I like a lot, where she interviews different researchers on developmental language disorders and everything in reading, actually. She doesn't focus as much on the language side as she does on a whole bunch of stuff. So I highly recommend that. She hasn't had new episodes in a while, unfortunately. She's had some health difficulties, but we're hoping she gets back to that podcast soon. And I also highly recommend her article with Suzanne Adloff in 2018. The journal Language, Speech, and Hearing Services in Schools has been rocking it lately, has some really helpful research going on there. So if you're one of those people who has a stack of journals on your computer or on your desk that you can't ever seem to get through, add this to the top of the pile. So like I said, the oral register of syntax and vocabulary is really important, especially for students with learning disabilities and language disabilities. But then we also find from Dr. Foreman's model that I showed that this academic register is really important for all kids. And instead of just leaving all the language knowledge to the speech language pathologist, we need to bring it into to all educators who are working in schools and working with children. So Yakov Petcher and I did a study where we looked at, particularly for writing achievement, just how much do we need to pay attention to vocabulary knowledge and syntactic knowledge. And so we looked at 2 grade levels where, in Florida anyway, the written composition is tested in the state achievement test. So those grade levels are grades 4 and 8, end of elementary, end of middle school. And we find that at the end of elementary and at the end of middle school, that throughout that time frame, syntax and vocabulary are very important for ensuring that students will pass the writing state assessment. And so we measured vocabulary, syntax, and spelling. And we measured reading comprehension as well. But I'm going to talk about the combined impact of vocab, syntax, and spelling. So in 4th grade, we were able to predict 61% of the variance on if a student would pass the writing assessment or not with vocab, syntax, and spelling, just those 3 skills. And here, this also points to how vocab and syntax are very integrated with spelling, in that vocabulary, syntax, and spelling shared about 40% of the variance in what they predicted, and that the unique variance of vocab and syntax was about 14% unique, above and beyond just spelling. In 8th grade, that shared variance increases, and then the total variance by the 2 combined also increases. So we find they're pretty darn important. The other thing that I thought was really fascinating from this study is that the unique variance predicted by vocab and syntax was almost the exact same unique variance that was predicted by reading comprehension. So our reading comprehension predicting to writing abilities shares a ton of variance with spelling, vocab, and syntax. And its unique amount is about the same unique amount as vocab and syntax. So that suggests to me it's pretty important to think about. So usually, when we think about vocabulary in particular, we think about assessments that look at vocabulary. They're usually pretty good assessments, but they just tell us how many words a kid knows. And that is helpful to know, but it also tends to be pretty narrow in the type of instruction it leads to, in terms of, let's just teach more kids more definitions as much as we can. But recently there's been some exciting development in creating assessments that look more closely at things that might be more generative in terms of instruction, more helpful for instruction. So I'm gonna briefly show you one assessment of this. So I've actually written a couple of assessments of vocabulary, morphology, and syntax. On this one that I'm showing you, this is the Monster PI. It's a new assessment that was funded by an IES grant given to Amanda Goodwin, who's the current editor of Reading Research Quarterly. And Yakov Petcher is a co-PI on that. And so I wrote the syntax task of this, and it currently is commercialized through Ventures Learning. So I do need to disclose I receive a minuscule percentage of the royalties from the Monster PI as sold by Ventures Learning. So keep that in mind while I describe it. But here's a good article reference down here about the technical properties of the Monster PI. And really what I want to use it today as is to give you an idea of the aspects of vocabulary and morphology that are really helpful to consider when you're watching kids use their vocabulary and their morphology for instruction. So vocabulary, it's not just the definition that's important. We want to think about how synonyms and antonyms increase students' knowledge and flexibility with using words. If you know what words it's similar to and what words it's dissimilar to, cognitive theories of learning would suggest that this reinforces our learning of new words. Analogy, so understanding the types of categories that different words belong to. This also has been really helpful in assessment. And then also thinking about teaching students how words relate to each other by using analogy. And then polysemy, so here's another word that we should break down using our morphological skills. This has the word poly and emi in it. So poly meaning many. This is where I'm gonna, something about a word. Yeah, I'm gonna mess that one up. But that just goes to show I need to go look that up. So polysemy means multiple meanings of a word. So these are the aspects of vocabulary that we want to think about. For morphology, I'm going to pull up how they measure morphology. Can I get a thumbs up from somebody? Are you seeing my, yes, thank you. So I kind of like this task where they have a whole bunch of tasks, probably 10 different morphology tasks. One of them is, here are 3 words that share a morpheme. Are they the same morpheme that these 3 words share? So estimate, classmate, and roommate. Which word does not have the same morpheme? Everybody's probably just been lulled to sleep by my voice. That is fine. Yes, thanks, Amy. Estimate. That is the word that it's even pronounced differently, estimate versus classmate, right? So that kind of gets at, are the students noticing these morphemes and what they mean? I also like this sentence task where they get a sentence like amphibians are create that live both on land and sea. And so you have to take this, the morpheme from create, and add the affixes to it to make it the correct meaning and part of speech to go into the sentence. So here's a challenge. Ooh, Katie is on it right there. Amy and Julie all got the creatures. Very nice. So here's a couple more types of how students might continue to manipulate their morphology knowledge. They would read the sentence, the experiment required materials to be equidistant. What does that mean? The materials are A, equal in size and weight, B, spaced out evenly from each other, C, from faraway locations, or D, ordered spatially. Oh, mostly B's. We have one D in there, although maybe that's just a reversal. Spaced out evenly from each other. Yeah, so it's making sure it gets that equa part in it, being equally. Great. So yeah, as you can see, there's quite a few different ways that they're measuring morphology. The vocabulary is measured on those different aspects that I already described. And then the syntax task is using connectives. So the way this works is you would see two simple sentences. So in this one, Gabby spent most of the summertime at camp. She liked it. She was eager to return home. Which of the following two best combines those sentences into one? All right, we got A's as the answer here. So this takes advantage of connective words like the word although. So although is a tricky one. It's a adversative connective, meaning that the two ideas are conveying two different things from each other. In some of the studies that we've done and some of the work that Cherish here has been working on, found that these adversative connectives are ones that develop later on in development. So that makes them more challenging. And we find especially these adversative connectives, as well as the causal connectives sometimes, are the ones, especially when we see students using them in their own writing, that means they've really solidified their syntactic skills. So let's go back to this. So those are some of the tasks that are in the Monster, well, those are all the tasks that are in the Monster PI. And they are continuing to look at how this is helpful for informing instruction. So let's look more specifically at written language when we examine students' written composition, which is what I'm really, really interested in right now, as well as my doctoral students, Cherish Sarmiento, who's on right now, and Julie Bremer is on our advisory committee for this, where we're really trying to nail down what are the ways that we can measure in students' writing their ability to show their knowledge of vocabulary and syntax, And then how does that relate to their overall writing development? And then can we connect that to important instruction? So what's been really cool, our most latest findings that are still making their way through the publication process, but we've completed all these analyses, is we do find that these 4 areas are really important. So the first one being spelling errors. And this fits within the thinking about vocabulary, because when we're writing a vocabulary word, we're using our morphology to spell that word. So this overlaps into that thing that we're going to talk about next month, transcription, which is the spelling and handwriting keyboarding. But we do find that this is a useful thing to think about and predicts really well students' overall writing abilities as well. We find that errors at the sentence level, so errors in punctuation, syntax, and grammar, also predicts a chunk of the variance in students' writing quality. And then we find actually that the total amount of correct spelling and correct punctuation and grammar, so correct usage at both the word and sentence level, it explains quite a bit of students' variability in their writing quality and their performance on state level assessments at the end of the year. We also just finished up some analyses the other day that shows that this quantity, the quantity of correct spelling, punctuation, and grammar, predicts students' reading comprehension better than our other measures of writing quality. So look for that one to come out in maybe a year. It might take it to get through the publication process, but that I was just blown away and jumped out of my chair and ran around my house, and it's COVID. So the only other person who gets to listen to my excitement about things is my husband. So I will share the excitement with all of you guys today about that finding. Yeah, I'll repeat that because it's a doozy. So we found that the total quantity of correct spelling, punctuation, and grammar predicts students' reading comprehension abilities better than our other metrics of writing. So measuring writing quality. A big one for teachers is we measured 6 traits. Has anybody heard of using the 6 traits model of scoring writing? So we found that this score, this total quantity of correct spelling, punctuation, and grammar, predicts reading comprehension better than 6 traits, like way better than 6 traits. So that was a shock. Oh, passage comprehension assessment, of course, is number 1. Thanks for asking about that. So there was a question in the chat, how does this metric compare to passage comprehension assessments? So of course, passage comprehension predicts reading comprehension the best because it's lined up in terms of what it's measuring. So we've got a lot to dive into there and try to figure that out too, like why it's doing that. I want to try to get some of my doctoral students involved in trying to figure out why this predicts reading comprehension so well. Speaking of doctoral students doing exciting things, this last one is thanks to Cherish Sarmiento. She wanted to figure out what aspect of academic language we could measure in students' writing, especially at the word level. She looked at word and sentence level and was really successful at the word level, finding that the number of long words that a student had in their written composition was a major predictor of their writing quality. And so This was simply the number of words that had 7 letters or more in it. So she also wants to know why words with 7 or more letters is such a predictor of writing quality. And well, we can look at some of our other metrics to tell us. One of her hypotheses was that maybe it's the words from the academic word list. So the academic word list lists all of these words that are really useful in academic contexts. And she found, nope, the academic word list is too limited. It doesn't include enough words. So that wasn't it. But in some of our other studies, we found that the density of mature words, so this is something called mean text lexical diversity. No need to memorize that term, but what it basically means is it's how often students use mature words. Mature words being words that you learn later in life. And so some of you may have seen some studies where they talk about age of acquisition. So Cooperman created this age of acquisition list of basically the age at which most people in the US acquire certain vocabulary words. And so this gives us an idea of, okay, maybe it's something about development and exposure to these bigger words. So that might be part of this thing that's explaining why it's these big words. And then the other thing that may be explaining this is words that have many morphemes. So words that have multiple prefixes or suffixes. We also find gerunds predict writing quality pretty well. Gerunds meaning the morpheme ing is added. All of these are kind of clues as to why these bigger words are really important and what they tell us about a student's learning of vocabulary, and also give us some pretty specific targets then for instruction, for teaching students well enough that they can use these words in their own writing. Because we know there's this difference, right, between recognizing a word's meaning and then understanding it well enough that we would spontaneously use it in our own expression. All right. With that, let's dive into that instruction. What can we do to try to improve each of these facets and things that we now know play a significant role in students' writing, in students' reading comprehension, in their literacy in general? This is where it's not as fun because the results are not quite as exciting, but we have some directions to go. I love this article in Reading Research Quarterly from 2020. Rebecca Silverman and her colleagues did a huge meta-analysis of all of the language interventions. So these would be language interventions that were run in rigorous, well-controlled studies. And they looked at I love that they lumped together vocabulary, morphology, and syntax in this meta-analysis. So that was pretty exciting to see. So what did they find? Well, they found that when interventions are targeted towards language, almost all of them include some component of teaching vocabulary. Also, almost all of the studies that they found that had an effect embedded other components. So almost none of them were standalone interventions. The vocabulary had to be embedded with maybe decoding, reading comprehension, strategies for reading comprehension, discussion, And a few, only a few, included writing, which I was kind of sad to see, but maybe more will in the future. About half of the studies they found had started including morphology instruction, so that within the word piece, not just outside of the word part, that probably earlier studies in vocabulary might not have included as much morphology instruction. The largest challenge, as I alluded to when we slid into this instruction conversation, was the effects. So they found pretty decent effects on the words that were taught. So the visual over here, it's super busy, not meant to be read, but the visual here on the bottom, it has this dotted line down the middle. This dotted line down the middle is an effect size of 0. And then the dot shows the effect size of each study that was listed in here. And this is the effect size on words that were taught. So you can see that we have quite a few interventions that had some effects that were different from 0. And then we have a few that were small. Again, this is on the outcome that this effect is on is the words that were taught in the intervention. A bunch of studies also looked at, did that generalize the effect on the words that were taught? Did that generalize to a standardized measure? And up here in this top graphic, you can see the effect sizes on the standardized measure, that there were only a few studies that measured it, and there were very, very few that actually had an effect size larger than 0. So our challenge in the field still remains that we need to, we're having an effect on vocabulary, and you know, that's pretty darn good. We should be pretty happy about that, but we also need to keep going to try to have a more generalized effect. Now, there could be a whole bunch of other things happening here too. It could be a sleeper effect. So learning vocabulary, it takes a long time to acquire new words. We need to see them in more contexts in our regular life. So maybe we're just not detecting the effect. And we also know that it accumulates, right? When you learn a couple new vocabulary words, that helps you learn, opens the door to a whole bunch more vocabulary words later. So our effects might actually be further on down the road, and we're not detecting them in the studies. It could also be that regular instruction, the business as usual condition, the control condition, is just getting so good because people like you are learning lots of things about how to be really effective teachers. And so it's hard to find a control condition that there's no vocabulary instruction happening, right? We don't want to be doing studies in schools that don't have any vocabulary instruction happening. So when you compare the effect of a new intervention with really strong vocabulary instruction that's already occurring in the school, you're not going to see an effect size. So that might be a piece of it as well. But one of the directions that people are really encouraging others to go in is embedding this vocabulary instruction within multiple components that are really effective as well. And I think, to me, that's the next direction that studies need to go. We need to fully integrate vocabulary, morphology, syntax, spelling, and strategy instruction at the discourse level. And I'll talk about that in a second, that people are going in that one particular direction. Something I want to highlight at the adolescent level, the SERP Institute has put out several interventions that they have had IES grants to study. I've gotten the word generation. I've downloaded all the word generation materials. They're really fun. And then I've read the studies. They're really interesting in that these are typical vocabulary studies, that they have a great impact on the 10 words that are taught each week. But again, just don't generalize to larger outcomes. But I still think it's a practice worth doing, and they have been trying to integrate it into other pieces. So one of the cool things with word generation is they integrate it across content areas. So you have the same words, how those words apply to your math lesson on Monday, and how they apply to your science lesson on Tuesday and your social studies lesson on Wednesday. I think that's really interesting. They try to pull in some writing and some discussion. They have to debate. Students will do debate on different topics. That's really neat. So I like those pieces because they draw upon evidence-based pieces that we know. So let's move into syntax instruction. This is the place where we do have one intervention that's got some pretty good impacts, and that's using sentence combining and using sentence frames. What's nice is these are pretty easy to do and easy to integrate into whatever instruction you have going on. And the IES practice guide led by Steve Graham that you can find on the IES website has some materials on how to do that. thinksrsd.org also has a section about this sentence combining. You can go download those materials for free there as well. And so this is helping students put together meaning within sentences, figure out what different clauses mean, and put them together. So here's 3 really great activities. Sentence framing. What I really like with some of the sentence framing, it's not in this specific example, but there's other examples out there where they'll plug in sentences that use the adversative connectives being things like although, however, oh man, my mind is blanking, but it's those words that convey an opposite meaning is going to happen from one clause to the next. So I really like those to try to really push students thinking about those types of concepts. Sentence expanding, because we find that students who write longer sentences and wider varieties of sentences, that really predicts their writing quality. And then doing that sentence combining practice where you have 2 or 3 sentences and you need to put them together into one more complex sentence. Again, we have the same problem here, same challenge. I shouldn't call it a problem, same challenge that we all need to solve as vocabulary, where the sentence combining interventions have an impact on sentence combining, but they haven't generalized to written composition quality. I think that when it's combined with something as powerful as SRSD, that it might do that. Karen Harris and Young-Suk Kim also had this hypothesis and put together a really amazing grant and really amazing study that they have conducted in early elementary, and they're working on getting that out there. So I highly recommend you all keep your eyes peeled for what they're calling SRSD Plus, which integrates these other aspects of writing that SRSD hadn't previously integrated. Also for measurement of these word and sentence level academic language skills, there's a really great assessment led by Paolo Ocelli at Harvard called the Core Academic Language Skills Assessment that gets at these aspects of syntax and vocabulary and morphology. And then going back to this idea of, if we learn more about how students develop, especially students with learning disabilities, how they develop their language skills, it'll tell us a lot about both reading and writing. And Young-Suk Kim has another paper coming out on that about the interactive dynamic literacy model that I recommend everybody looks out for. So we've got about 5 minutes. I'm just curious what people were interested in, what made them go, what made them think, what do you see in your classrooms that you're doing that's going to take us all to the next level?
I have a question, Adria.
Yes, Julie.
It's Julie. So I'm still kind of hung up on your big discovery that correct spelling, punctuation, and grammar predict reading comprehension stronger than other measures, including 6+1 traits, that one. So that's really exciting. And it also drummed up some ideas of conflict for me, because I've read in the research that one of the default ways that, especially at the secondary level, teachers are teaching writing is so hyper-focused on just grammar and mechanics. And I worry that a study like this would encourage that rather than the more thoughtful aspects of teaching writing. So what do you think about that?
I'm so happy you brought that up, Julie. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Because that is something I should have said. That one of the things we know doesn't work, as you pointed out, is sentence diagramming. So there's been lots of focus, and there's been some study on grammar for the sake of grammar and sentence diagramming for the sake of sentence diagramming. And those studies have shown negative effects, bad impacts on writing. So we don't want to do those things. And you're exactly right. If we focus on this, the errors that they're making and stopping students, mid-thought and having them go back and correct their spelling errors or add their periods for punctuation, we're really disrupting the flow. And we know that doesn't work. And we want them to get their thoughts on paper first, revise later. And that's going to be a major challenge for us. My hypothesis is it's really the errors in spelling and the errors in grammar syntax are actually related to the meaning part, right? That's where we need to focus the intervention. And so I don't know, you're going to have to solve this, Julie.
I just think it's going to be really important in the message to really highlight the distinctions you just said, which I know you would do. I just don't want the wrong message to be taken away. That, oh, look, all we need to focus on is grammar and spelling, and then kids will be great writers and read better. Nope, not quite that easy. So
there you go. That's the way to put it. If only it were that easy.
Right. I'm also going to drop a link in the chat for anybody who's morphologically obsessed like I am. There's a website that came in super handy for me when I was in the classroom with middle schoolers. Maybe some people know about it. It's called membean.com, and it's all roots. And it's just a really handy resource. So I will put it in the chat if anybody wants to grab it.
I want it. Thanks, Julie. Emma, would you mind describing what I'm not familiar with colorful semantics. Can you describe that? Has anybody heard of colorful semantics? I've never heard of it. Amy, do you have a thought or question you'd like to share?
I have so many thoughts. I have a daughter who has math dyscalculia, not diagnosed DLD, but everything you're describing, reading comprehension. The math was so pronounced that I think we ignored, and she was reading okay, like she decoded, she did everything. So not until it got more, she got more advanced in grades did we realize the language gap. And there is a dearth of information about this. Like as a parent, and I have watched like every webinar on reading. I'm a former English teacher. I feel like I just want to hug you. Like this information is so, I wish I'd had it years ago. But anyway, my question is, I'm trying to take my knowledge and help other children, like more tutoring one-on-one and really focused on writing. My experience is our district did like nouns and verbs in 3rd grade. And then in 4th grade, they were trying to do 5-paragraph essays. So I haven't really experienced what mentioned about an over attention to grammar. But I'm curious with my own tutoring. I use William Van Cleve's Writing Matters, and it's hard I want to get them generating sentences, but you still have to kind of talk about what a subordinating conjunction is. So I'm trying to find that balance of doing that and doing like, I just want to pull the biggest lever possible because the kids I work with are in middle school and they're lost, and, feeling it like anxiety and all these other things that we hear about. So, I'm curious about that, like how explicit the teaching needs to be. Like, you have to do parts of speech, but then quickly getting to making sentences. And then also as a parent, how to support, my daughter's reading night and they're not really doing any vocabulary with it. And she'll never understand. That's such a really tough read if you don't understand vocabulary and syntax. So, I guess I have a question about how to support her teachers because I want her to be in school, and also how to do my students explicitly. That's a big question. That's too many questions. But anyway, that's what I'm thinking about.
These are amazing, amazing, amazing things that you're thinking about. And I think based on your experience and the things that you're doing, that you're solving them and you're thinking through it really, really, really well. I'm going to disappointingly only point you to a couple of other places that are doing a couple of cool things, like chipping away at this. So one of them is there's some researchers looking at math language right now that I love. And they're Sarah Powell, Powell. Yes, I'm sure you've seen her with all of her writing or her math stuff. Her stuff is fantastic. So she did some work on looking at the effects of math writing. So writing about math. And what that makes me think is, the students are having a hard time just generating things. And I think of Berninger, who says, if I can think it, I can say it. If I can say it, I can write it. And so even if they need some of the scaffolding with writing it, that's where it's, they'll say it out loud and you might be able to help them to write it out. And that's where your conjunctions can come in. You don't need to call them conjunctions. Maybe she says something and then you say, because, and ask her to expand, right? So that's that sentence expanding. Or you say, although, and get her to combine it with another thought. Elizabeth Hughes is another person who's doing some math language stuff that I think is really cool. But otherwise, Amy, you get back to me when you figure all of these things out to talk to the teachers. And we've gone over, and I'm just thrilled to see all of your responses in the chat, and I can literally hear your brains working from over here. So thank you all so much for thinking and engaging with this. I'm really excited to see where the field goes. And I hope to see you for transcription in February.
Yes, and we'll bring this to a close just for to respect everyone's time. I'm sure that the questions are just building up and building up, and maybe at some point we could just have an opportunity to just come back together in more of an open conversational way to wrap this up that people have processed, and come back one time for, or maybe join us in our literacy lounge, Dr. Truckenmiller, because we have the literacy lounge where it's just open conversation, it's organic. So I want to just thank everyone for your participation. I know my brain is just so full of all these connections and the work that we'll be doing in my county. So Michigan thanks you. The Reading League Michigan thanks Dr. Truckenmiller and all of you that are participating and doing the work. I'm going to totally destroy Cherish's name, but Cherish and Julie Brummer and everyone doing this work in our great state. We are just honored to have you, and thank you for the work that you do. And thank you for educators that are showing up. And there's a lot going on in schools today. People are tired, people are sick, they're short-staffed, and we just appreciate you digging in and showing up. You are a blessing to our children, and we thank you for the work that you do. And we just ask you to continue to consider supporting the Reading League Michigan and our mission. So thank you again, and be well, be safe, and we'll see you February 15th to wrap this up with transcription. Good night.